Have you ever heard of a guy named Lester Bangs? Highly recommended. How about Greil Marcus or Jessica Hopper? Maybe the names David Frick, Bill C. Malone, or Ann Powers ring a bell? I'm a big fan of Craig Havikhurst and Kim Rule, whom you may have come across too. If any of those names are familiar, then my bet is that you're an avid reader of music journalism, music history, music criticism, music biographies, or maybe all of those categories of writing. Even if you've never cracked open a book about music or delved deep into music reviews, or perhaps especially if so, our guest on this episode offers a lot to hold your attention. He was a staff writer at the Raleigh News and Observer for 28 years. He has also written for Rolling Stone, Billboard, Spin, and the New York Times. His latest book is titled, Oh, Didn't They Ramble? Rounder Records and the Transformation of American Roots Music. David Menconi spoke with me in fall 2024 at the IBMA conference in his adopted hometown of Raleigh, North Carolina, in a conversation which touches on the remarkable story of Rounder Records, a music label whose story, as David puts it, is the Kismet story. A label formed by three idealistic folkies fresh out of college, it went on to champion the music of artists ranging from Alice Gerrard to Alison Krauss, from the Blake Babies to Billy Strings, and from Ted Hawkins to Tony Rice, whose rendition of the Bill Monroe classic Monroe's Hornpipe from the Bluegrass Album Band Volume 6 is playing now. David talks about Rounder Records and a whole lot more, including the current state of the music industry and the challenges faced by writers and musicians alike, as well as the significant history of bluegrass music in the city of Raleigh and the state of North Carolina. I'm Joe Kendrick, welcoming you to our episode on David Menconi on Southern Songs and Stories. Southern Songs and Stories is a proud part of the lineup at both Public Radio WNCW and Osiris Media, the leading storyteller in music. Follow Southern Songs and Stories wherever you follow podcasts, with more at southernsongandstories.com. You can engage with us on social media. Southern Songs and Stories is on Facebook at Southern Songs and Stories, on Instagram at South Stories, and my YouTube channel is Joe Kendrick NC. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September, towards the beginning of the International Bluegrass Music Association's conference and World of Bluegrass Festival. Seeing that it has been 6 months since then, as I say this, it would seem that I'm pretty late in the game with this episode. It reminds me of the Chris Guillebeau quote, "The best time to start was last year. Failing that, today will do." David's interview came towards the end of a busy festival season, which found me, like many years, stockpiling many interviews as they came available and putting them in the schedule for eventual release. That's the first reason why you're hearing this just now, but I have a feeling that there are other much less straightforward and even somewhat mysterious reasons why this came together now. For example, I came upon a book by author and jazz musician Ted Goya at the same time that I began going back over my interview with David Menconi, and was surprised to come back across David mentioning being an avid reader of Goya's work. Also, the spring issue of the music journal No Depression recently arrived, which included an article on the struggles of music artists to reach the middle class. This topic is also one David and I discuss here. These kinds of synchronicities make an impact on the finished work. It is impossible to guess exactly what effect they will have now versus how this episode would have turned out had it come out last year, but it gets me thinking about things like all the anecdotes of hit songs that were recorded as an afterthought, when there was some extra studio time left over. There are many, many examples of serendipity in the music world. Rounder Records was one of them. Maybe this podcast is having its moment right now, too. Kismet. Our conversation begins with my question about the history of bluegrass music in Raleigh, which is not where he grew up, but has been David's home for decades. Here is David Menconi.
Coming up on 34 years, so I'm about as close to a native as anybody gets anymore, it seems like. Raleigh's place in bluegrass history in North Carolina, and Raleigh specifically in North Carolina in general, has a bigger one than you think. Most notably Earl Scruggs. I mean, the music wasn't bluegrass until Earl Scruggs joined Bill Monroe's Bluegrass Boys, 1945 at the Ryman Auditorium, and he's born and raised in North Carolina, learned to play here, learned his style by listening to what he heard on the radio around here, and that's what really launched the music. I mentioned Bill Monroe. He and his brother Charlie were touring around the Southeast, setting up shop at various radio stations, and they spent a good long while at WPTF here in Raleigh. And it had come to you'd set up in a certain city and then play there for a while and kind of fish it out, as it were, and then move on to the next town. And at the end of that, Charlie Monroe told his younger brother Bill, we're going to leave tomorrow at whatever time it was, and if you show up, then we're still a team, and we'll go on to Chattanooga or wherever it was they were going to go. It's funny if it would be Chattanooga, since IBMA's leaving for that, but I think actually it was Knoxville. Anyway, Bill did not show up, and that was the breakup of the Monroe brothers, and Bill went off on his own and started bluegrass. But, you know, at the very end there, Raleigh's where they were when they split up. And then one of their big hits they recorded over in Charlotte, What Would You Give for Your Soul? And, there's plenty of excellent contemporary bluegrass bands that have come from here, Steep Canyon Rangers, Chatham County Line, and, of course, Tony Rice. And Curly Seckler was another. So, yeah, lots of the giants of the genre have come from here.
David, you've covered music for decades, and you've written many books, so you're in the deep end of the pool musically. You know a few things, but this whole week of IBMA and World of Bluegrass, you know, the whole culture of it reminds me that it's about that musical connection, but it's about a lot of family kind of connections, a bunch of adoptive family sort of, you know, great lasting friendships that are, you know, steeped in this whole experience. So I wonder what other kind of connections you might have to IBMA other than from the standpoint of being a writer.
It's funny, it took me a few years to actually join the organization. I should have done it sooner than I did, but it's been really interesting and cool to have them bring their big industry event here. And there were times, I was at the News and Observer for 28 years, and the last, let me think about this, 6 years of my time here was when IBMA was here, and covering the organization. They had some upheavals. It's funny, there was kind of a crisis in the organization right after they came here with the World of Bluegrass, because it was so huge. I think they were unprepared for how big it was going to be and how to deal with that. There were lots of resignations on the board and upheaval and turnover, but it all got sorted out, and it's been a really wonderful, very successful partnership. I'll be real surprised if they can duplicate the success of it anywhere else. But we've got kind of the perfect setup for something like IBMA, with big venues like the Outdoor Amphitheater, real nice big convention center, a walkable grid of downtown nightclubs, and excellent restaurants and other things that you'd like, and decent hotels. It was a partnership that really thrived for a lot of reasons.
David, you've got plenty of colleagues from media that are writers for all sorts of outlets, and you yourself are kind of both an author and a writer. I wonder if you have any comment about advice to young writers. What might be your biggest challenge right now, and what might be your biggest upside right now?
Wow. It has never been an easy nut to crack, writing for a living, but it might be harder now than ever, it's got a good side to bad side. The good side is you can get your stuff out there with no filters very easily, just the push of a button. The downside is there's so much out there. How do you stand out in that ocean of content out there? Legacy media is just dying from 1,000 cuts. The newspaper I was at for 28 years, the News and Observer, we used to have 250 people in the newsroom, and when I left 5 years ago, we were down to 40. So, it's just evaporating.
Meanwhile,
fast.
Profits are very good at a lot of those in those businesses, a lot of those media, behemoths, Gannett, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, they make more money than you'd think. In the case of my former employer, they got under billions in debt from a really ill-advised merger, and that was the big problem. So even though they were making money on the balance sheet, they had just hundreds of millions of dollars in interest payments they were having to make. They restructured it some and put off some of that, but my gosh, they were laying off tons of people every month for a long while there. It was pretty dispiriting to be a part of the death of newspaper media.
What do you think of all of the DIY platforms that you have available now, like a Substack? Or do you participate in any of that?
There's some really good ones. I do not have a Substack of my own. I certainly read a fair amount. Like Ted Goya is one that I read religiously. I think he's a really good thinker about music and culture in general. So yeah, there's certainly good content out there. I mean, it feels like now more than ever we need filters and gatekeepers, and that really has gone away. It's just kind of poke around out there, see what you find that you like, and bookmark it and come back to it.
It's such a fast culture, and I think retention is really the big hurdle for at least me. I won't say for everybody, but there's so much content so fast, and it's such eye candy, and it's so distracting. It's hard not to get caught up in that whirlwind when you're making content, and I hate that word content, but here we are. So a writer, somebody making videos, you're making content, and that's where it's at nowadays. Is all about that, how you can leverage that content.
Pivot to video is that was one of our eras as the newspaper thrashed around, and they really wanted us to do videos, and most of them were terrible, at least the ones I made, because I just have no aptitude for it. I have things I can do well and things I can't, and I felt like the last few years I was at the paper, what I was good at was no longer in demand.
This is a bit of Ted Goya's song Tango Cool, the title track from his 1990 album with Mark Lewis. David mentioned reading his work religiously, and coincidentally, I've been reading his fascinating book, Music to Raise the Dead, for free on Goya's page on Substack, which is a website and app geared towards writers. Ted's page there is titled The Honest Broker and is well worth checking out. He writes about more than music, too, the state of education in a recent article titled What's Happening to Students, also media in an article titled Why Journalism is Like Stinky Cheese, to give you just a couple of examples. Coming up, David Menconi talks about his book, Oh, Didn't They Ramble? Rounder Records and the Transformation of American Roots Music, after we get an ear for one of the record label's milestones, which came in the year 1972. Norman Blake was the first artist to get an advance from Rounder Records for his album Back Home in Sulphur Springs, a princely sum of $500 for the collection, which went on to sell 30,000 copies. In folk festival picking circles, it became an essential album, and this song was especially celebrated. Ginseng Sullivan.
About 3 miles from the Battelle Yard on the reverse curve on down, not far south of the town depot, Sullivan's shack was found, back on the higher ground. You could see him every day, walking down the line, with his old brown sack across his back and his long hair down behind, speaking his worried mind. It's a long way to the Delta from the North Georgia hills, and a tow sack full of ginseng won't pay no traveling bill. And I'm too old to ride the rails or thumb the road alone. Well, I guess I'll never make it back to home, my muddy water Mississippi Delta home. Take one, Ted.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Rounder book, what you've got on the radar, how that's rolled out?
Of course. It is a history of Rounder Records, which is quite a tale. Rounder grew out of the folk revival of the 50s and 60s, and kind of in the shadow of that, at a time when the major labels, the big companies already established, were no longer interested in those folk acts they had been putting records out on in the wake of Tom Dooley, Kingston Trio. And Rounder started out as this hippie collective, 3 young idealistic people, and grew into arguably the biggest independent label in the world. They started out putting out folk and bluegrass records, George Pegram and old-timers like that, and moved on to the young'uns pretty quickly. Spark Gap Wonder Boys from Boston were one of their early bands, and they had a hand in their careers over the years of some really important major acts. Tony Trischka, Bela Fleck, later on Alison Krauss. They had some wild card hits too, like George Thorogood, the blues rock guitar player. He came along at a time when they were still very much in their acoustic folk and bluegrass thing, playing this loud, raunchy rock and roll, and they got talked into putting it out, and it was improbably successful. It's kind of, you could subtitle the Rounder Records story the Kismet story, because just so many times they had good fortune to wind up signing somebody at just the right time. Alison Krauss being another. They signed her when she was a teenager, and within a decade she was one of the biggest pop stars out there. And that paid a lot of bills for a lot of years. So the founders of the company ran it for about 40 years before selling it. And they donated their archive to the University of North Carolina's Southern Folklife Collection. So UNC Press was interested in a book about them, and they had me do it. I was not the first they contacted. I was the third. And I was working on another book for them before that, and their excuse was, well, you were busy with the North Carolina history book, or you would have been our first choice. And I was skeptical about this. I told them, yeah, I bet you tell all the girls that. But I was the one who actually signed on and got it done. And it's been fun. We've done a lot of readings and stuff, some of them with the 3 Rounder founders, who are they are somehow running another record company all these years later, which kind of blows me away. Ken Irwin, the oldest of them, just turned 80 years old, and he's launching a new label called Down the Road Records. And doing the same kind of folk and bluegrass sort of stuff he's always loved and always done. And he will be scurrying around looking for his next act to sign here this week. I don't know how he does it.
Going back to the very beginning of George Thorogood and the Destroyers catalog for that excerpt of the Hank Williams classic, Done Blues Style, by the trio of George Thorogood on guitar and vocals, Jeff Simon on drums, and Bill Blau on bass. This is another pivotal moment for Rounder Records, whose three founders David Menconi refers to simply as the Rounders: Ken Irwin, Marion Leighton Brevy, and Bill Nolan. The Rounders were reluctant to sign this journeyman bar band guitarist from Delaware, mainly because his amped-up blues rock was such a far cry from anything they had put out, even the blues records they had released, which were acoustic. But one of his biggest fans, who was also a regular visitor to Rounder Records, had a lot to do with getting Thorogood signed to the label, and Thorogood himself was persistent enough to win them over. It worked out magnificently. After some radio airplay all the way across the country at a station in San Francisco got the ball rolling, the 1978 LP Move It On Over became Rounder's first to make it onto the Billboard charts, and also the label's first gold record. As our conversation continued, I asked David Menconi about his take on new media and how record labels that followed in Rounder's footsteps have fared in the era, since they had hits with George Thorogood and later Alison Krauss.
Well, the record industry has kind of, mirrored the rest of the world and the culture and the economy, and that the 1% is doing better than they ever have. The record industry in the U.S., it would probably be overstating it to say they nearly died a decade ago, but it wasn't that far off. They lost more than half their revenue in a few short years from the online revolution. People just stopped buying pieces of plastic and did all their listening online. A lot of it through file sharing and downloading and whatnot that they weren't getting paid for. So they went from $15 billion a year in revenue down to less than half that. And they were desperately trying everything to find something that would work. Things like ringtones and stuff like that. They did for a lot of years. Yeah, remember that when you'd actually buy a phone ringtone?
They made so much money on ringtones.
They really did. Yeah, it worked for a few years, but then they hit on streaming. And man, that is when another financial golden age for the corporate record label media kicked in. They now make over $20 billion a year. But boy, is that concentrated. So the Taylor Swifts and Beyoncés of the world are doing great, absolutely mopping up. Your Interscopes and Sonys are doing fine, and everybody else is kind of scrambling for table scraps. 'Twas ever thus. It's just maybe drawn the lines a little harder and made the gap a little wider the way things are now, but it's not that far off from the old days that people pined for. There never was a huge middle class in the music industry, but like everywhere else, it's shrinking.
I'd say there's a resiliency here in the roots music world and the bluegrass world. I just see lots of more in renewed interest in young generations and people from, being practically a toddler to being 90 are out there picking this week especially. But I see that as a really healthy sign for this corner of the music world?
Well, that's the good and the bad thing about this kind of music. It never gets huge, with a few rare exceptions, your Billy Strings or Alison Krauss's aside, but it never goes away all the way either. So it kind of rises and falls. You'll have an Alison Krauss, you'll have an Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, where it briefly comes into fashion and is arena-sized for a brief period. And then it recedes and you're back to the usual folk festivals and World of Bluegrass and things like that, and that's fine. And, I don't think anybody really gets into this style of music thinking you're going to be top of the charts. And it takes a lot of fluky things for that to happen. A Coen Brothers movie with a sort of a quirky soundtrack, something like that. But the great thing about the modern era is, as hard as it is to make it, quote unquote, in the mainstream way that used to be, it doesn't seem to be stopping anybody. Some of the best records I hear now are local artists just self-releasing stuff. It seems more pointless than ever to chase after that major label record deal, and it doesn't have to be a drawback not being signed.
Yeah, the whole DIY spirit is thriving and widespread in this community. So in that sense, they're doing pretty well because they have a job. They get to play music a whole lot. They love that. It enriches their life. They can sell a few records. They can tour or, become a full-time band. And that happens fairly often, regularly. And those people do, not arena-sized, like you said, but it can be a pretty good career.
Yeah, it really can. And then there are the occasional exceptions. Billy Strings now is the big one right now. It blows me away how huge he's gotten. And it's just, it's like the Grateful Dead. It's the live thing. Not really aware of what his record sales are like. I assume they're at least respectable, but selling out all these arena-sized places is just really a tribute.
Billy Strings here as we begin to wrap up this episode of Southern Songs and Stories with one of David Menconi's picks from his companion playlist to his book on Rounder Records. I put the link to his playlist in the show notes, and you can also find it on Spotify. David said that he did not know what Billy Strings' record sales are like, but it will come likely as no surprise to you that Billy's record sales are quite strong, indeed historic. He's no longer on Rounder Records, which had been in the hands of Concord Music Group for almost a decade when the song you're hearing now was released. But his 2024 album, Highway Prayers, made it to the top overall spot on the Billboard Albums chart. It was the first bluegrass album to make it to the #1 slot since another Rounder release did it back in 2002, with the soundtrack to Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? This song, Away from the Mire, is from Billy's first album on Rounder, the 2019 collection titled Home, which did not break any sales records but did win the Grammy Award for the Best Bluegrass Album, the first of his 2 Grammys so far, which add to a slew of IBMA awards, ranging from New Artist of the Year to Guitarist of the Year to Song of the Year and Entertainer of the Year. Currently, David Menconi is freelancing, considering whether to start writing another book, and actively working on bringing books into the UNC Press series he edits called American Music, New Roots, which has some similarities to the American Music series he co-founded at University of Texas Press and edited for nearly a decade there. The American Music New Roots series kicked off last fall with Eddie Huffman's biography of Doc Watson, followed by Sam Stevenson on jazz pianist Bill Evans, and Tommy Goldsmith on bluegrass legends, the Stanley Brothers. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us, and we hope you can help us by spreading word about what we're doing. It is as easy as telling a friend and following this podcast on your platform of choice. From there, it takes just a moment to give us a top rating and, where it's an option, a review. It makes a huge difference because the more top reviews and ratings we get, the more visible we become to everyone on those platforms, which means that more people just like you connect with the artists you enjoy here. This series is a part of the lineup of both Public Radio WNCW and Osiris Media, with all the Osiris shows available at osirispod.com. You can also hear new episodes on Bluegrass Planet Radio at bluegrassplanetradio.com. Thanks to the IBMA for making this episode possible. Thanks also to Jacqueline Anthony for producing the radio adaptations of this series on Public Radio WNCW, where we worked with Joshua Ming, who wrote and performed our theme songs. I'm your host and producer, Joe Kendrick, and this is Southern Songs and Stories, the music of the South and the artists who make it.
Away from the mind and the senseless decisions of somebody's wasted desire. Through the smoke and the wind and the fire. Spring light to us this year again. Can't stand to face the fear again. You could always laugh about those things. It's enough to make a man feel sour. Burning minutes every day by the hour. Just to end up gone like everything else. Will you always laugh about those things?